Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Emmett's weekly webinar this week on anti-Semitism in academia. I want to first thank Lorraine Pelisov for her generous sponsorship of today's webinar. We graciously appreciate it, Lorraine, and anybody else who's interested in sponsoring a webinar, please do reach out. As always, your support, your financial support for the Endowment for Middle East Truth is much needed and greatly appreciated. Without your support, we could not do what we do. Today's webinar will be recorded, and if you have any questions, we'll try to get to them at the end of, towards the latter part of the webinar. So please put the questions in the Q&A if you have any for our guest speakers. I'm going to keep their bios abbreviated because we have a lot to talk about. Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. He's also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Kenneth Marcus is a founder and chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. He's a professional lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School, among other academic affiliations. During his public service career, Ken served as the Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Civil Rights under the Trump administration. So welcome to both of you. I can't thank you enough for joining. I know that I've got two real experts on this topic, and I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy hearing your insights. It's difficult really to know where to begin here, since we've all been in this space for quite some time. And I'm sure I speak for the three of us when I say that what's finally being discussed on a near daily basis since the atrocities of October 7th and the ensuing anti-Semitism that so openly invaded our college campuses, and I might add our city streets, malls, town councils, and the like. It's not surprising to us. The question that American Jews now have, since they're finally understanding just how widespread and systemic and dangerous campus anti-Semitism is what can be done about it? And we're going to get into that. But I first want to talk about the issue itself. So I'm going to start with you, Asaf, and ask you to spend a few minutes talking generally about the rise of anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses over the past decade or more, and what you've been seeing taking place. For quite some time, Jewish students have been dealing with anti-Semitism, taking the forms of all sorts of crazy things like faux eviction notices on their dorm room doors, Israel Apartheid weeks, and the like. These incidents are happening seemingly on every campus. It's from the California campuses to the New York City system, state universities, Ivy Leagues, and private institutions, and so on. And yet very little in terms of disciplinary action by college administrators has occurred, let alone steps to protect Jewish students. And some of the things we've seen are clear violations of campus codes of conduct, whether the poor student walking on campus at Harvard who was surrounded, or the students who were forced to lock themselves in a room at Cooper Union. You and I have written a couple columns on this, beseeching administrators to address the anti-Semitism on their campuses to no avail. So Asaf, can you discuss what's been building and perhaps why administrators have been reluctant to deal with this, refusing to enforce their campus codes of conduct and singling out Jews seemingly as the only minority on campus not worthy of safety and security?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. You, Lori, of course, and with Ken. Both of you have been longtime friends, and Ken was one of the original board members at SPME, so it's nice to be all together amongst friends. You pose obviously a large question. We can talk about that for hours, but let me try to kind of contextualize what I've been observing, what we've seen historically, pre-October 7th and kind of post, and kind of put into a little bit of context in the time that I have. What we're seeing really is the embodiment of what's been happening for decades on American college campuses. This is really a result of what I would consider to be coming out of the PLO playbook, as far as the hijacking of what we call in the social sciences agents of soft power, the academy, journalism, and whatnot. This has been happening since the 50s and 60s in North America at large, where there's been the idea, especially coming out of the Arab world, but especially coming out of the Palestinian narrative, that if we can't defeat Israel on the ground, we can win the hearts and minds. And so that process has been taking place through years of decades of buying, and I say this tongue in cheek, but it's no joke, while the Jewish community has spent a lot of time investing in the academy, we may have bought the buildings, but the opposition has bought the education. And so the clear intention of the money, which is a critical aspect of all of this, is the fact that they've been investing in buying chairs and departments with the idea that if one buys a chair or a department, one also buys the politics in which these topics are being taught, which have been with the sole intentional predetermined goal of creating sympathetic views towards the Palestinian narrative, the Arab viewpoint, and with the clear intention that of flipping the narrative, that is to say that Israel is the quintessential evil, that is the Goliath, and the Palestinians are the David. And that has been happening throughout multiple disciplines. I come specifically and trained out of Middle East Studies. Middle East Studies has been the kind of the hornet's nest of all of this. But it is widespread throughout the academia, throughout all disciplines. And, it's not even true anymore. 20 years ago, he would have said, maybe less, that, in the social sciences, it's pervasive in religion. STEM still makes it, 1 + 1 = 2. That's no longer the case. I mean, really, facts don't matter. So you have this entire narrative that's been built into a crescendo that led to this reality. I would also note that it's also important to note that much of this ideology that the Palestinians adopted is very much similar to Soviet ideology when they were trying to hijack American institutions in the 50s, the Center for Ethics and Policy and other kind of institutions. The same modality is based on that, which is again ties into the Soviet impact on Palestinian ideology. I mean, Yasser Arafat and company were predominantly mostly Marxist than they were anything else. And this kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology of ingraining this victim-victimizer mentality that we see shaped out here within the DEI critical race theory construct that has been implemented on American college campuses is a result of how they have been able to make that happen. Fast forward to October 7th, what all of this did, and really, this one point before I get to October 7th, by the time BDS in its kind of current formulation kind of emerged and erupted after the Durban conference, they've already fed into what I would consider to be a pre-existing condition. So you had faculty, administrators who already been preaching this reality. And so by the time you start seeing these massive amount of demonstrations in South Africa calling for Zionism as racism and the fact that Israel needs to be destroyed, an apartheid analogy, all of this was already ready there for them to utilize, and it was already fertile ground to jump off to the reality that we're seeing today. And once Nelson Mandela was out of the scene, by the way, apropos on the apartheid analogy, we needed a new Mandela to make that happen. And of course, that was also fed into the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. Very easy to kind of find a new apartheid to galvanize on because, the world rallied about trying to take down apartheid. Here's another kind of contemporary reality or perceived reality based on that viewpoint that they could rally around. All of this leads to, the intensification or the zeal and adulation that we saw emerge right after October 7th. This is, on the one hand, from a military kind of a tactical standpoint, the war that Hamas wanted. And not only is this war front on the ground, it's a war on American college campuses, because what it did was really expose, for those who weren't really watching carefully, really Hamas in America or the Muslim Brotherhood's infiltration into American society at large. And what we've seen, I mean, it was fascinating to observe. I wrote a piece 2 days after the war began about how the adulation and really the celebration of Hamas on American college campuses. We've all heard about what happened at Cornell with Rick Rickford, who was going around saying that he was exhilarated by Hamas's actions. And you had others, but interestingly enough, from a vernacular kind of phraseology standpoint and how this was all being defined, the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic has always been looked at as a colonial project. And so the language that was used to describe all of this was decolonialism, in order to kind of crack down on the colonial and narrative, not to mention, of course, the fact that Israel, from what they were able to export very positively and very successfully is the debate about race in the United States of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. So, of course, Jews are seen as white, Palestinians are seen as black. And so, of course, we have to combat racism. The Israelis export racism. We're going to crack down on this on American college campuses with this kind of adulation. And so all of this is the backgrounder ideologically to what all of this played out here. Now, the challenge, which I think Ken and I, of course, I think agree on, is of course that the Jewish community has had two problems over the years, not necessarily in that order, is of course proving one, that we are minorities, and B, that anti-Semitism is racism, and on both accounts, we have not been so successful over the years making those cases. And so when you look at this reality of how it's been shaped, and you're looking at, the understanding that Jews are the quintessential evil, and the staggering numbers, really, even before October 7th happened, of this steady rise in anti-Semitism as a result of BDS, as a result of the infrastructure that the universities have created as fertile ground of this religiosity within what has been described kindly and kind of cute in a way of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Equity and inclusion for all, with the exception of Jews. With the idea that, the ironic part about the DEI construct and its narrative at large is, of course, that they are being racist in their own actions, but you only have inclusion for some groups. And racism is only one thing. And within the gold kind of pyramid standard of intersectionality, the gold standard of oppression is the Palestinian narrative. And if you support any kind of progressive liberal cause, you cannot be anything else but that. And so, but you cannot be, above all, you cannot be Jewish and a progressive. You cannot be a Jew and supporting LGBTQ rights or women's rights or whatnot. So you have to choose. And when you have to choose, the way that everything has been layered here is that choosing on the side of justice or whatever is perceived to be right is the side of the Palestinians, the kind of the quintessential victimology mentality. And so we don't fall into that characterization. And really in tandem, every time Jews have said anti-Semitism, the response has been, no. You are deflecting from the real issue of the Palestinian problem. And of course, that's pinkwashing. And so you're deflecting from the atrocities that take place, human rights violation, the use of international law. This is all of this, in its entire background. So October 7th comes about. And so instead of saying we're going to condemn barbaric Nazi actions where Jews are being killed and raped and maimed and whatnot, similar to a Holocaust, which is exactly a contemporary Holocaust that is happening now. No, the response is we got to support the victimology mentality of what led to that to happen, what they perceived as happened, and that's why we got to support Hamas, not taking into context that Hamas is, of course, a terrorist organization. And so that's really the how we got here in a nutshell.
Thank you, Asaf. Quite a lot packed in there. Ken, we're going to turn to you, and I wanted you to talk more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which Asaf raised, and how we've gotten to this point where the hatred of Israel and the Jewish people is so ingrained in campus ideology. So I just want to run through quickly a few statistics that I think are important in understanding the moral perversion of Gen Z, who are seemingly the product of this DEI indoctrination even before they get to college. In a recent Harvard-Harris poll, 48% of 18 to 24-year-old respondents said they supported Hamas. 51% of this group said that Hamas's violence against Israeli civilians was justified. 62% agreed that what Hamas did to Israel was genocidal. So in other words, a majority of 18 to 24-year-olds believes that genocide against Israeli civilians is justified. And perhaps that's because 67% of those individuals also believe that Jews as a class are oppressors and should be treated as such, which Asaf touched on. So can you talk about the DEI programs on campus? They're heavily ingrained, funded, staffed up, and it seems like entire generations are being indoctrinated with this stuff. And also, more importantly, what are your insights on its longevity now that Claudine Gay has been forced to step down? Do you think that might be the beginning of the end of this being enmeshed in the system?
I'd be happy to, Laurie, and thanks for having me on. It's always great working with you, with Emet, with Sarah Stern, and a pleasure to see my former colleague, Asaf Romirowsky, as well. And that was quite a nutshell we just got from Asaf. So my thanks to him as well. So on DEI, constantly we're hearing the refrain, and sometimes we actually continue the refrain, that it is just wrong to have DEI programs that omit Jews, that we cannot continue to have in corporate America DEI offices that deal with every other ethnic group, every other racial group, every other national origin group, but not Jews. And I actually think that's true, but it's not the whole story. We need to ask why it is that Jews are omitted. And sometimes the excuse is that they don't deal with religion and they don't want religious groups, but only racial or national origin. But that denies the full identity of what it means to be Jewish. We're not merely tied by faith or practice, but also by peoplehood. So there are real erasures of our identity that occur when they say no Jews. But it really isn't enough to say that DEI officials should continue doing exactly what they're doing. But remember on May to recognize Jewish American Heritage Month, or add one slide to the deck having to do with anti-Semitism or Jewish identity. Certainly the fact that they're not doing any of those things is a problem, but that's not the whole problem. As I think Asaf alluded to a moment ago, there's also the question of who is doing DEI. We've seen the research from the University of Arkansas, Jay Green's team, that at the campus basis, there is, from the study of their tweets, an extraordinary obsession with Israel among DEI officials, and that obsessiveness is almost entirely anti-Zionist, to the point of being anti-Semitic, as Professor Green has demonstrated at great length. So one could ask the question, how is it with this personnel that one could expect that they would be the right people even to try to teach about Jewish identity or anti-Semitism? But then the problem runs deeper than that. It goes to really the fundamental basis for the current DEI ideology. And I should distinguish now, because there are some people who support DEI and there are other people who oppose DEI. And what I find is that generally speaking, they're talking about two very different things when they say DEI. People who support or oppose increase to the minimum wage at least are talking about the same thing when they say the words minimum wage. But those people who support DEI talk about something that they will tell you has existed for decades and is fundamental for the protection of everyone's rights. That's because they're not talking about the contemporary movement that succeeded what I would call diversity management. They're talking about the whole cluster of apparatuses within universities and corporations. When people criticize DEI, it tends to be not the whole shebang, but rather an ideology which is based upon certain dichotomies between oppressor and oppressed, between white supremacists and BIPOC victims, where Jews show up, if at all, only as whites. And it really doesn't even matter if the Jews happen to be members of other ethnic or racial groups as well. Currently, when Jews are ignored, but then raise their hand, they're told to own their privilege as white and treated as hyper white, treated as people who have really an extraordinary amount of power, wealth, and privilege. In other words, the conversation tends to shift straight into traditional anti-Jewish stereotypes. But even if you added a session on anti-Semitism to a DEI course, if you kept the rest the same, you would necessarily retain the worldview that feeds into this notion that Zionists are the oppressors and that other groups are the victims. So there really is fundamental to the current DEI ideology a problem that runs much deeper than the mere omission of Jews, Jewish identity, and anti-Semitism. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to get rid of DEI altogether. There are reasons why we should continue to fight discrimination, why we should continue to work to make sure that everyone feels included, valued, and respected, to make sure that we are recognizing talent and skills wherever they exist, no matter how they're wrapped. All of those things should continue. But just as we had other ways of doing that before the current DEI fad, we'll have other ways of doing it afterwards. Lately, there have been articles in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere about how ESG is becoming a bad word. That didn't seem fathomable 6 months or a year ago. ESG had become ascendant to the point that it seemed to be a kind of an orthodoxy. And yet we may now be seeing the high watermark has passed when it comes to ESG. It is conceivable that the same is true for DEI. And there are some signs that people have increasing concerns about it. But whether that will happen or not, it's hard to say. Equally hard to say is what will come next. Because the answer to DEI isn't to say no DEI, it's to find other ways to make sure that we're addressing anti-Semitism and other social problems, but that we're doing it in a way that does no harm. In other words, that we are responding to discrimination or exclusion in ways that don't perpetuate the very problems that we're trying to solve.
Thanks, Ken. Asaf, I don't think we can talk about anti-Semitism on college campuses without discussing Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP as it's known, and the Muslim Students Association. Even Jewish Voices for Peace are all over campuses now. Can you share with us what you know about SJP and these other organizations, their ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, even other Muslim American associations, the American Muslims for Peace, CARE, and their financing, for instance? We know that where there's an SJP chapter, there's a 7 times greater incidence of campus anti-Semitism, and yet there's over 200 SJP chapters strewn across the country. I think since the Hamas war, there have been 2 chapters that have been temporarily suspended, and I think that's about it, despite their activities on campuses that are breaches of codes of conduct. So, SPME, we focus on faculty because we know students come and go and faculty are here to stay, but these students are moving into the real world and they're taking their hateful ideology with them into corporate boardrooms and halls of Congress and whatnot. So can you talk about these organizations, and do you think that there will be, again, an enforcement of codes of conduct or a backlash to them on campuses?
Right. No, it's a very good question. I mean, again, and related to, the focus that we do at SPME, many of the students today who are involved with SJP are now faculty. And one of the founders of SJP is a well-known Professor Khatam Bazian, who's at UC Berkeley, who heads the Center for Islamophobia. I mean, there are many who are, the echo chamber continues. So, I mean, it's not that this, it just started with students, it continues on and grows into the, and climbs up the chain, so to speak, as it relates to this narrative. SJP is a subsidiary of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are connected to a group called the American Muslims for Palestine. There has been over the years, there's been evidence, the people have, that have been out there as far as ties directly coming from a group from the BDS National Committee in Ramallah. There's money coming in from Ramallah directly into American college campuses and vice versa. Hamas in America is been well known. I live in Philadelphia, so one of the things that we're not known for, but people should be aware of, is the first mosque, for example. The first Hamas meeting was here in South Philly back in 1988, and so there's been a growing infiltration of the use of groups on college campuses, with the idea of creating, in contrast to the Jewish community, they create student activists, and with the idea of creating a clear mechanism of perpetrating the clear ideology. Over the years, there have been many professors, going back to people like Sami Ilarian and others, who are raising direct money for terrorism. It's still going on today. The challenge is, as it relates, and this is, related to, I think, more to your point, the Attorney General of Virginia recently opened up a case where, investigating the ties between AMP and SJP and their terrorism ties. Arizona is doing the same thing. To your point before, Brandeis is the only school to officially cut off ties with the SJP. They've been suspended from Columbia and NYU, I believe, is where they are today. But there's, again, going to be a fundamental question going forward now as far as practices when it comes to what is all of this doing to the admissions process. Do we have direct ties to terrorism? Can you prove that? Are you going to start asking students who are applying, were you ever a member of a like you do with the State Department, a foreign terrorist organization, and what does that do, as it relates to all of that? Hamas is still listed as a terrorist group. SJP is not defined as such; is not designated as a terrorist organization. We know they have ties to these groups, and they've had, they've had ties with individuals who've had third and second tier ties to monies that are going into terrorism, similar to groups like CARE. And so you have, individuals like Nihad Awad, who's also been in the news of late about his ties, and we know about his direct ties to the Brotherhood and other kind of, dubious individuals with ties to terrorism. The Muslim groups on campuses, ISNA, MSA, WAMI, and others, and the list goes on, different charities or groups. The problem with this infrastructure, and this is a challenge that we are looking to expose, is the fact that if they are a registered group on an American college campus, they get money from the university, and so the idea that the money is being laundered also by the university itself, it's hard to kind of see the connection of where what the money is clean and what's not clean. What's happening on the outside is that the SJP conventions, similar to when they go to AMP conventions, they have similar kind of raising funds for ties that do have more direct ties of monies to other kind of direct terrorist ties. So that's part of the exposure of this larger issue. But they are Hamas in America. I mean, this is a group that is the Muslim Brotherhood in America, so if we see Hamas is a terrorist organization, which it is, and they have subsidiaries at American college campuses, which they are, and they're working in that regard, and then they graduate and they go and they get jobs working for aides, for congressmen and senators and whatnot, and they bring that kind of ideology with them. That's what you're seeing as the official byproduct. That's on the level of the practical level. Then you have the level of the faculty level, where you have individuals who have been teaching this topic and they teach Hamas ideology on American college campus. That's a problem. Back in 2004, for example, I was one of the people who exposed a Fulbright member who was a member of Hamas back at Florida, at FAU, at Florida Atlantic University. Eventually, because we exposed the story, was able to be deported. And what he was doing before he came to the States, he was writing textbooks for Hamas. And so what do you think he's teaching in his class about Intro to Islam? And so there's an entire layer of the fact that even the kind of introductory to Islam, the way it should be taught and the way it's being taught is being taught in the most perverse and the most radicalized Islamist version, which we see on the campuses today. So again, it's no surprise as far as the background goes that when October 7th hits, they're all there supporting their peers. And so this kind of jihadist narrative is all there. So, I mean, one of the questions that needs to be looked at very carefully by all our institutions is really, what are we doing to crack down on terrorism? Is this a violation of codes of conduct of universities, which again ties into tainted money that's coming into universities? And again, I think that one of the recent points that was raised in the Ways and Means congressional hearings, what does all this do as far as violation of tax codes when it comes to universities receiving gifts? Is there a violation of FARA? Is there a violation of other kind of ties? These are the kind of things we need to do. We need to do a much better job as far as cleaning up our institutions going forward. The other part, I'll just end with that point as well, that, having an SJP on the campus, but then going through, to Ken's point before, to a DEI training and saying, oh, okay, now they're okay because they learned and they can come back to campus, that's also not going to solve the problem. It's also putting on Band-Aids. So we have to look at the larger issue here and also see, and to look at the infrastructure when it comes to the ideology, the money, the individuals. It's all part of understanding and learning how to break down the playbook.
Laurie, since Asaf mentioned Brandeis in his response, I should clarify that he was not referring to the premier civil rights organization fighting campus anti-Semitism in America. That would be the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. I think he was referring to a university in Waltham that has no relationship, although we're pleased to share our name with them.
Point well taken, Ken, and that is exactly correct. The university, Brandeis University, not your institution at all, not even remotely close.
Very good.
Good points. So, Ken, do you believe that the campus adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliances, or IRA as we know it, that definition of anti-Semitism would help? I mean, Asaf and I have been speaking for years and years about getting colleges to adopt IRA, and we failed. Not that we didn't fail, but just the pervasive adoption of IRA across college campuses has not taken hold. And I think one of the arguments against it is free speech, academic freedom. And it seems to me that the First Amendment doesn't prevent college administrators from enforcing campus codes of conduct. And yet, again, I keep coming back to that. They seem to be hiding behind these free speech claims while ignoring their, I think, fiduciary duties to protect all students on campus. And there's also President Trump's executive order, which basically adopted the IRA definition while recognizing that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and national origin and sex, can also prohibit anti-Semitism. That, I believe, is a tool that you used when you were in the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, and you were enforcing the executive order, from what I understand. But under the Biden administration, it looks like it's sort of been ignored at OCR. And then also, someone mentioned earlier, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, as it's making its way through Congress. And Emmett has been integrally involved in pushing for that. So from your perspective at Brandeis, what do you see are the tools that, and we'll get into lawfare in a couple minutes, but what can be done with these types of things that I just mentioned that could help with these anti-Semitic issues on campus?
So I'll tell you a secret, Laurie. You didn't really fail. There are university administrators who have various reasons why they don't want to embrace IRA. And I try to let them down gently when I tell them it's too late, because they already have. They have already, on a regular basis, signed assurances to the U.S. Department of Education that they will comply with the laws, statutes, regulations, and executive orders of the United States. Sometimes they also say guidance. So that means they have already made a binding commitment to the United States as a condition of substantial funds that they have received, that they will comply with laws that include the very executive order that you have mentioned, Executive Order 13899, President Donald Trump's executive order on combating anti-Semitism, which may be archived within the Biden White House website, but remains live. And unlike so many of President Trump's other executive orders, it has never been rescinded and remains in active force. Now, while the Biden officials seldom speak boldly or clearly about that order, they have never taken it down, nor have they taken any measure to rescind the guidance document that incorporates the executive order into the active policy of the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, which is the regulatory authority which conducts enforcement over these very universities. OCR's guidance materials developed and posted during the last administration remain on the active website portal of OCR. And not only that, but are regularly listed whenever this Biden administration describes the guidance that's pertinent to the field. So for example, on the day that President Biden issued the national strategy on combating anti-Semitism, Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman, my successor, who then became my predecessor, who is now my successor again at OCR, issued a Dear Colleague letter, which listed at the top of the sources that very guidance. And similarly, on the website of OCR, you will see that guidance prominent. So it remains active. And if you ask them quietly, is it still enforced? They'll say yes. Now, the problem is twofold. First, they have promised again and again that they would give durability, strength, and prominence to that executive order by issuing a regulation that has been promised for the last few years, and which this administration just announced in December that they would postpone by yet another year. That's a problem both in terms of the optics and also in terms of the policy. It's also problematic that they are not willing to speak about it with sufficient clarity that even experts would know about it. The fact that you can be unclear about whether it's there or not suggests that the Biden administration is not taking the sort of approach to campus anti-Semitism that you would like. On the one hand, they can say it's still there, it's the active policy, we haven't taken it down, we continue to mention it whenever we list the policies that are active here, but they don't take actions. With one conspicuous exception, they don't take actions that make it clear that they're taking it seriously. The one conspicuous exception is the University of Vermont case. That was a Brandeis Center case that was resolved by the Biden administration last year. They didn't specifically mention the executive order, but the decision from OCR really would not have made so much sense without it. So it is there. It is the basis for the one important resolution they've made. You can't argue that they're not following it, but it's hard for them to make the case that they are using it with the sort of effectiveness and forcefulness and boldness and clarity that one would like to see. Now, you mentioned First Amendment concerns, and I would say there really are no more First Amendment concerns about this guidance than about any other civil rights law. My feeling is that whenever one enforces civil rights, especially with respect to hostile environment, one needs to be very careful about whether one is inadvertently violating other rights, especially the First Amendment. And that's true under any of the civil rights statutes that OCR enforces. IRA is a definition. It doesn't limit anyone's speech in any way. The executive order uses IRA in a way that is very specifically crafted. It does not say that people cannot say what they want to say. It does indicate, however, that the words people can use may be shown to be evidence of motivation. If you say that you hate Israel, that may be protected speech. But if you say that you hate Israel and then throw a rock, smashing a window at Hillel, your words may be used to show the motivation was to hit the building and that it was a hate crime that was motivated not simply by skipping stones, but by a desire to do damage to a Jewish institution. So I would say that IRA remains a part of the regulatory edifice of the United States. It is something that university presidents regularly commit to follow, but they do it without the sort of sincerity that one would expect, without the follow-up one would expect, without the clarity one would expect. And that is why it is so sorely needed that we receive either the leadership that the Biden administration has promised but not followed up on, or else action from Congress, such as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that you mentioned, and which is now pending before both chambers.
Thank you, Ken. That was very insightful. Much appreciated. So Asaf, I'm going to turn to you to discuss faculty. And I've been looking through the questions. There are quite a lot of them, and a number of people have asked about faculty. So, I mean, last week there was an MIT professor who resigned, and he stated, "These past few months since October 7th have been deeply disappointing to me. During a time when the Jewish and Israeli students, staff, and faculty were particularly vulnerable, instead of offering the support they needed, the broader MIT community exhibited open hostility towards them." And he added, "Some areas of study at MIT seem to prioritize promoting a specific worldview over teaching critical thinking skills. This seems to have been institutionalized in many of MIT's departments and programs." I would argue that that's been institutionalized in K through 12 and higher education. Unfortunately, critical thinking is not being taught. So going back to faculty, I want to know, number one, where are the pro-Israel faculty? I know that they are a minority on campus by far, but are they frightened and cowering the way Jewish students seem to be? Or, why aren't they speaking out? And on the other hand, the flip side of that, and more importantly, I think, is that the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel professors like the Judith Butlers and Laura Sheehy's of the world are tenured, they're numerous, they're loud, and they are intimidating. So what's the deal with faculty, Asaf, and what's happening with that?
Look, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, SPME was created to, support faculty. I mean, part of the raison d'etre of SPME was the fact that faculty feel isolated, they feel alone, and the number one goal was to try to create a sense of community. And if anything, while we have, a significant list of faculty on American college campuses and around the world, on each individual campus, there may be like 2 or 3 who are there. And if they're tenured, maybe they're speaking, maybe they're not. If they're not tenured, they're not talking at all. And I think that the hostile environment, and the political toxicity that has been exhibited on the majority of American college campuses is really indeed threatening. I mean, we've seen physical threats to faculty over the years, even before October 7th. Individuals who've had swastikas, drawn on their cars, knives put on their, on their doors, physical and of course verbal abuse on American college campuses towards the pro-Israel community, Jews and non-Jews. If they side with, if they're sympathetic towards the Israeli Zionist narrative, they are ostracized. So it takes a lot of courage for faculty to speak out. Positively, we've seen over the years some lawsuits exposure. People are now, are really indeed airing some of the dirty laundry, which is indeed positive to hold the institutions accountable for what's happening. But they are in a very hostile sea, which we are, which they are faced to deal with. The other hat that I wear vis-a-vis ASMIA, I mean, within Middle East studies, it's even more toxic, where individuals have been forced not only to go to MESA, the group that we were created to counter to create, which is a very hostile pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian institution, and I would argue today an advocacy organization, since they openly endorsed the boycott movement, BDS at large, and they are no longer really anything, and they're not a scholarly academic association at large. At all, for that matter. And that there's been copycats by other similar disciplines, American studies, the Asian studies, women's studies, and whatnot. And so it's a very difficult situation. The advantage that students have is, of course, that they have Title VI on their side to help them when it comes to discrimination. That same reciprocity, and of course, Ken can talk a lot more about that than I can, go into greater detail as it relates to faculty. So unfortunately today, we are in the business of giving a lot of pro bono legal advice for faculty who need that. They need support. They need support, also resources from the outside as far as community efforts and donors and others to speak out for some of these issues. It's a very complex situation. I think that the other part of this larger issue, of course, relates to their position within the institutions themselves. And this relates to your point before, Lori, about how they fall when it comes to DEI matters as Jews. And so when, the unfortunate reality that we've discovered over the years is, of course, we have a very healthy fifth column. Many people would argue I'm Jewish, and would try to argue and do argue the opposite narrative. So really our number one job, and the way I've been seeing, where we've been seeing as far as the acceleration of what's been happening, is to help support and bolster our faculty who are doing the hand-in-hand combat on the ground, given the administrations they have to deal with, their own chairs, their own departments. And so what we have is a nucleus that needs to be supported. We need more. And the other part, which is also a point that needs to be enforced and critical point, is helping younger junior faculty, untenured faculty, get through the tenure process, establish themselves in the academy, get published in peer review, which is what we do, have academic conferences, give them what they need as faculty to ensure the fact that they're there. Because our biggest concern, as both of you know so well, is that while we have today some amount of balance on campuses, the trajectory that I'm looking at today, that if we don't do something now, 20 years down the road is going to be nobody to talk to. And so the people that we know who are on our side are, there are natural causes. Either they're passing naturally or they're retiring or whatever the situation is. We have to make sure that we have strong people in their 40s and 50s and 30s who are getting through the process and are standing up for what should be the role of the university, to your point before, as institutions of higher education, standing up for those liberal values, dealing with inquisitive research and actually doing the research and not buying into optics or basically being spoon-fed in the echo chamber of DEI or critical race theory or whatnot, basket weaving, whatever they're looking into, that is not really what the university should be producing. And I think that what we have now as an opening, just one point to add, as a result of the hearings that happened over about a few weeks ago with MIT, Harvard, and Penn, there's also an opportunity for Jewish donors to say where their money is going, what institution we should be supporting, what are the avenues we should be looking at as far as maintaining the academy. The irony of all ironies is, and I say this again and again, but it's important, it's been spotlighted now, Jews and Catholics are the two largest populations who invested the most amount in the academy. And now it's those same institutions who are now turning on them. When October 7th happened, actually Catholic universities reached out to Jewish faculty and students, says, come to us. We're a much more safer environment than what you're seeing on some of the other places.
Thanks, Asaf. There's a lot of questions in the queue, but Ken, before I turn to them, I wanted to have you spend a couple minutes talking about legal avenues that can be used to address the prevalence of campus anti-Semitism. And I know that Brandeis, and that would be your Brandeis, not Brandeis University, has filed a lawsuit against Berkeley. So perhaps you can share with us some of the specifics of that case. And I believe there's other lawsuits that are making their way slowly now to being filed and claims to be pursued. And if you can give me your thoughts on also that the House of Representatives is also running some investigations into what's going on our campuses. If you have any insights as to that or other OCR investigations, please share.
Sure. Thank you, Laurie. The Brandeis Center, the Louis D. Brandeis Center in Washington, we've built it up over the last dozen years. We're now more than a dozen litigators talking every day to students and those faculty that Asaf isn't providing pro bono legal service to, and representing them, giving them counsel, in some cases, working with university administrators to ensure that they can voluntarily comply with federal law on the rights of Jewish students, but where they will not voluntarily comply, holding them legally liable. That can mean bringing them before OCR, the agency that I twice before ran, the agency in the federal government that controls all of their federal education funding. Can also mean taking them into federal district court, as we did with the University of California at Berkeley. That case involved both the bylaws at now well over 12, perhaps as many as 19 different organizations within the law school that have said, if you are Zionist or if you support the state of Israel, you may not speak to our group on any topic whatsoever, not just on Israel, but if you are an expert on, for instance, feminist jurisprudence, but you're a Zionist, you can't talk to us. They don't have similar rules against any other group for the most part, or at least didn't at the time. They don't have rules saying that racists can't speak to them or that sexists or misanthropes can't speak to them. You could be a murderer, you could be a rapist, that's fine, just so long as you are not a Zionist. If you're a Zionist, even if you're a victim, you may not speak to them. It is not about viewpoint. It is simply a matter, essentially, of saying no Jews, with Zionists being a proxy for Jews. So that's an example of a matter where we have taken the university to court. We are looking at other potential court cases. We're looking at other potential OCR cases. We are every day speaking to students and professors and others who may have standing. We have a membership organization. It is a part of the Brandeis Center called Jewish Americans for Fairness in Education. We're signing up members every day, and through our membership association, we're also bringing lawsuits. Laurie, in your question, you also asked about oversight. And I am pleased that yesterday, the House Committee on Education and Workforce followed up their prior hearings with demands for information from Harvard University. I was pleased to testify before that committee a few weeks ago to describe the problem, to urge them to do oversight. They did do some oversight. You may be aware that they actually had a few college presidents testify before them. And I have to say that the resignation of two of those college presidents is clearly not the end, but the beginning of the work that this House committee is doing. The length, the complexity, the detail of that correspondence issued yesterday, I think is a sign of the seriousness of the work that Chairwoman Virginia Fox is doing with her committee. One of the matters on which they're demanding information involves our clients at Harvard University who were harassed and there was an attempt to silence them when they said that they wanted to do a project on Israel as a Jewish democracy and how Jewish democracy could be improved. Well, that apparently was beyond the pale, something that cannot even be discussed at Harvard. The dean over there admitted in accepting findings of a Harvard investigator that this was discriminatory, and yet Harvard is not taking action. When university administrators are recalcitrant, that's when we may need to take legal action through a combination of congressional activism and through a combination also of litigation. So for those who are out there, we are speaking to students and enlisting plaintiffs and complainants every day at BrandisCenter.com. We also have a call line that we operate together with the Anti-Defamation League in conjunction with Hillel International and with the support of the Gibson Dunn law firm. That call line has now been getting an enormous number of calls, requests for help, and we're working with the students who reach out to the call line to determine what is the appropriate response, and in some cases that may mean legal action.
Thanks for that, Ken, and for all that you're doing with Brandeis. You and Elisa and your whole staff are doing great work. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the questions, and I just want to say to the people that posted questions that are of a personal nature, where you're asking for advice on how to handle a particular situation, please email me directly, and I can pass that along to Ken and Asaf. You can reach me at lregan@emmetonline.org, and I'm happy to help with any personal situations that you all are facing. But I'm not going to be able to pose those questions right now. So our colleague Asaf, Charles Jacobs. Hi, Charles. Glad you're listening in. It posed a question. Abe Foxman and David Harris, former leaders of ADL and AJC, say we must scrap DEI and it's not fixable. Meanwhile, current leaders of both organizations think otherwise. What must we do to force ADL and AJC to change their views and policies, and how much does it matter? And there are a number of people who have asked a couple questions about the ADL and where they are in all of this as well. So, Ken, Asaf, whoever needs to.
It's good to see Charles, and glad that Charles is here. First of all, I just want to stress one point that I wasn't stressing before. The Brandeis Center and Ken and Elisa, as you know, Lori, have been phenomenal partners for SPME over the years. We send our faculty to them for our legal help, and today we would not send. My advice is to never send. Faculty should never go to their administration without legal advice. So that's, just to put that out there. Ken, I thank you for all your past help and for your continued help in the future, dealing with faculty and guiding them throughout all of this. Charles knows this better than I, than dissecting, dealing with the ADL and the AJC and their position on DEI. I mean, I think that there is I think Ken alluded to this in his remarks about the conundrum of DEI for the younger generation, trying to create, a sense of, how we judge people based on their skill sets and merits and whatnot. The DEI configuration and its current formulation is indeed religiosity on American college campuses. And it is really part of the reason, to my mind, where we have the result of all of these problems relating to to the rise of anti-Semitism. It's the DEI officers where the portfolio of anti-Semitism falls on, and they can't see it, for what it is and identify it for what it is and take the proper actions. The legacy organizations at large, I mean, I think are grappling within their own. This has to do more, and Charles knows more about this than I do. The internal systems of Jewish politics in the American Jewish community, which go left and right in different kind of viewpoints as far as what we can salvage. I don't believe that in its current formulation, what DEI is proven to be, that can be solved. And I think that we have to call a spade for what it is. And I think that program is not helping Jews on American college campuses. I can't speak for those organizations. I know there's been, a great deal of movement as far as them defining what BDS is, getting over the hurdle of when does anti-Zionism cross into anti-Semitism. I think if anybody had any doubt, October 8th clearly proved that they are synonymous. They were not calling for death to the left or to the right. They were calling to death to Jews. And when you have those same kind of statements and pronouncements on American college campuses, to be very clear about what their end game is. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. In the recent column, that Brett Stephen works, that wrote in the New York Times, he spoke about the phenomenon of the October 8th Jews. I think that's people are waking up, and I would like to hope that these organizations are indeed waking up to the reality that we're facing. As you mentioned, Lori, correctly, anti-Semitism is on a steady rise and has been that way before the crescendo that happened on October 7th. And I think that we need to do that and stop this now before it gets much worse.
Yeah, and I would add that it's also everybody's blaming Claudine Gay for what's going on at Harvard. Her tenure was exactly 5 months. What's been going on at Harvard has been building it predates Claudine Gay and it's not going to go away just because she's resigned. I want to, Ken, can you talk about Hillels? One or two people have asked where the Hillels are on this. And there was an article or a letter that I saw written by the Harvard Hillel director, which was really horrific. He's not in our camp. And somebody else posted a comment here about BU's Hillel. So where are the Hillels helping these students?
So I mentioned before, Laurie, that Hillel International is one of our partner organizations on the call line. And I think that they have been helpful at steering Jewish students to the Brandeis Center and ADL. We have worked with Hillel International, including its general counsel, Mark Rotenberg, on a number of matters where we have found Hillel and Mark to be strong and helpful partners. Hillel remains a rather decentralized organization, maybe not quite to the extent that it was several years ago, but it remains an organization with many different chapters. The campus Hillels tend to have a high degree of independence. Some Hillels are actually part of universities, so that the Hillel director is actually an employee of the university. Others are part of independent corporations with separate boards of directors for each Hillel. So they're all very different. They tend to have different approaches to things based on their different boards and different executive directors. So it shouldn't be surprising if you would have different experiences with them. I will say that we have had very good experiences with some Hillels. Been particularly pleased with some of the cooperation that we've gotten in the Chicago area, for example. And there are other Hillels that I might not speak about as much.
Thank you. So one real quickly, I know it's one. Can you guys touch on federal funds and whether or not, because a couple of people have asked that, do you think that federal funds will ever be pulled? I know we've talked about, Ken, you were discussing the House of Representatives investigations, OCR, but when you were in the office, is that one of the remedies for these types of infractions against Jewish people?
Well, it is and it isn't. Technically, if OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, finds a violation and proves it before an administrative law judge or federal district court judge, there is only one ultimate remedy. You can't fine them. You can't make them fire their dean or president. All you can do is eliminate all federal funds to the institution, every nickel, including every Pell Grant to any student at the institution. That is the one and only official remedy at the end of the day. But for that reason, and because of the devastating consequences of the loss of all federal funds, it never really gets to that. What happens is that when OCR gets close to such a finding, it will begin a process of negotiation that could lead to any number of different sorts of remedies, some of which might lead to the firing of an individual, others of which merely involve changes, perhaps significant, to policies and procedures and training and the like. As for whether funds would ever be eliminated, so what I would say is last year there were something like 17,000 cases before OCR. The anti-Semitism cases are usually less than 0.1% of the total caseload of that agency. This year, post October 7, we're more than 0.1%, but still, this agency deals with a very large number of cases, of which anti-Semitism is just one piece. I don't know if federal funds have literally ever been eliminated for any entity, but if they have been, it's not been in recent memory. Occasionally, the agency gets close, and there's usually some anomaly to it. Usually, there's some odd specific reason why the institution fails to capitulate and why things go to the end. But usually, there will be some settlement at some point or other. But that doesn't mean that the possibility of losing funds is irrelevant. It is that sword of Damocles. It is that potential ultimate remedy and the extraordinary damage that it would cause that does bring institutions to the table to make the changes that they need to make.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up. There's a lot of questions still in the queue, and maybe we'll have you guys come back because there were a number of my questions I didn't get to as well. So maybe we'll do this again in the future. But people are asking about recording. Yes, this is being recorded. The recording will be sent out tomorrow after sometime during the day tomorrow, and it will also be posted on the Emmett website. And Asaf, I believe SPME will also be sharing it. SPME co-sponsored this webinar. I failed to say that at the beginning, so thank you for that. Again, Ken, Asaf, as always, you were unbelievably insightful. I appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Lori, thank you, Emmett. Thank you, Ken.
Good to see you both.